The training was developed alongside key partners within the BASW England Social Work in Disasters Working Group, including social workers with experience of working in disasters and those they have supported. This work also builds on the previous work of the BASW England Steering Group, including the development of guidance and learning outcomes for social workers in disasters, continuous professional development, and a commissioned literature review and the launch of the book, Out of the Shadows, The Role of Social Workers in Disasters. Prior to the COVID pandemic, sadly, we'll all be aware of the pain and suffering that many people suffered during this time. Disasters became a real prominent focus. Every single person present can consider themselves an expert by experience, having lived through incredibly difficult times with no preparation and with very little resources for members of the public to actually cope with. Things did change and develop, but we need to be honest about the difficulties that many people faced. Some of the content that we will be discussing today may be painful and sensitive, particularly for those with lived experience. And one of our professional officers, Rebecca Pierre, whose details will be online, will be available after this event if anybody would like to have a private discussion. We will also share details of relevant organisations or charities who can provide support after this webinar. There'll be an opportunity to ask questions at the end of the session, and please feel free to share your questions in the chat until then, and we will try and cover as many of them as we possibly can. I'd also like to say we appreciate it's a really hot day in many parts of the country, so please stay hydrated and get yourselves a drink as and when you need to. Finally, we would love to hear your thoughts as the webinar progresses. And if you're online, you can join the conversation by using the hashtag SWID BASW23. We're asking that everyone keeps the cameras off and stays on mute until the Q&A session. And our presenters will also keep their cameras off unless they're giving a specific presentation or in dialogue conversation. We are really honoured to have a number of people with us here today with lived experience who are brave and courageous to share their experiences. We also have partners and leaders from across the sector, and we really hope that this will be a fruitful event and that we can make sure that training in relation to social workers and disasters is truly embedded in terms of social work organisations and social work training. Thank you. To begin with, I'd like to introduce Ed Daffon. I apologise, there's a little bit of echo on the line, so I'm sorry about that. If everybody could go on mute. I'd like to introduce Ed, a survivor and contributor to Out of the Shadows, the Role of Social Workers in Disasters, and Angie Bartoli, Principal Lecturer in Social Work at Nottingham Trent University, and co-editor of Out of the Shadows. Just a final plea again, if everyone could please go on mute, that would be greatly appreciated. Over to Angie. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Hi there, Ed. Could you tell us who you are?
Hi, Angie. My name's Edward Daffon. I was a resident of Grenfell Tower for 16 years. I moved in 2001 and lived there until the night of the fire in the 14th of June 2017. I'm a registered social worker. I qualified in 2006, and preceding the fire, I worked in a community mental health team in Hammersmith and Fulham and Westminster Council. I was a co-author of the Grenfell Action Group blog and a community activist, trying to hold both our landlord, the Kensington and Chelsea Tenant Management Organisation, and our local authority, the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea, to account for the ill treatment we received as tenants and the sweating of assets by our local authority. And post the fire, I've been a committee member of Grenfell United, which is a bereaved and survivors group set up to seek truth, justice and change for those impacted by the fire.
Thanks, Ed. So really involved in that. I wondered if I could take you back to the 14th of June 2017 and whether you could tell us about the immediate response to the Grenfell Tower fire.
Sure. So, you know, when I think back to the kind of the events of the night and what happened to us, it's quite useful to describe it almost like a tragedy in 3 acts. So the first act was the way that we were treated prior to the fire, the way that we were marginalized, the way that as residents our voices weren't listened to. And then you come to the second act, which was the night of the fire itself, so the 14th of June 2017. And for me, that was marked by the sheer violence that was inflicted on our community by the fire and the loss of 72 lives and the destruction of our homes and our community. And then the third act was the abandonment that we experienced in the immediate aftermath of the fire. You know, on a personal level, I escaped with my life. I was lucky to get off the 16th floor and make my way down the building. When I came out of the building, I was confronted by this most appalling sight of the building on fire. Instead of there being help at hand, we were told by the police to just get away, and that some buses would come to pick us up, but no buses ever arrived. So we were left standing on the street. I had an ambulance worker shout at me to go home as I was watching my home in flames. And it was a very, very traumatic and upsetting experience. I would say the following days were characterized by 3 things. They were characterized by a complete and utter lack of compassion and care. They were characterized by a lack of coordination, and they were characterized by a lack of information. And I'm just going to give some very brief examples of what I'm talking about. So in terms of lack of compassion and care, so in the youth club where we gathered, that was opened by the community, the first people that came to see us were some housing officers from the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea. And we went up to them and we asked them that would it be possible for us to be kept together as a family and as communities? Could we be put in the same hotels or at least in the same areas as each other? And we were told by the housing officer who were we and who gave us the authority to make that request. And at the time, that was really, really upsetting. My own experience as a result of that is after losing my beautiful home in the Tower, I was placed into an emergency accommodation in a hotel in Earl's Court that didn't have any windows, and I had to share share a bathroom and toilet. And you know, on the night after I just lost everything that I owned, that was a very brutal and unkind way to be treated. I talk about lack of coordination. So at the rest centres, there was not a single person there from either local government or from the local authority that had any authority or responsibility. So we were basically left to fend for ourselves. And there were no allocated workers, either support workers or social workers, allocated to families. So again, we were basically left to fend for ourselves. And as to lack of information, the bereaved and survivors who came out of the Tower and gathered in these rest centres had no idea, even of their own family members or neighbours or other community members had made it out of the Tower. And in the days after the fire, we had to resort to putting a piece of paper on the wall, writing down our flat numbers. So I find this a bit emotional to talk about.
Yeah, let's take your time, Ed.
And against our flat numbers, we wrote who was safe and who was not safe. That was a level of abandonment by the state that we experienced. And I will never ever forget, we live in the 5th or 6th richest economy in the world, the 21st century, and the fact that we could abandon people to such a level, I find deeply shocking and must never ever be repeated.
Thank you, Ed, and thanks for kind of sharing that really brutal story with us. And we don't. The word thanks isn't enough to kind of express my views on that. Wondered if you could tell us a bit about the work that bereaved and survivors are trying to do to influence future disaster responses. So looking ahead.
Sure. So look, the lessons that we learned from that experience is very clear. You know, social workers, they need to become the fourth emergency service, almost with like a blue light response. In disaster scenarios, there's so much loss, trauma, and chaos that it needs a well-trained, well thought out professional response. And I think the evidence that I provided you previously shows that that's absolutely what we didn't receive. The skills, values, and knowledge of social workers are integral to any coordinated response to these disasters. And as a consequence of that, Grenfell United, the Bereaved and Survivors Group, have been working with our lawyers to ensure that we get in front of Sir Martin Warbick, who is chair of the public inquiry, a recommendation that in any future disasters, local authorities have a statutory duty to provide trained social workers to attend any disasters. I mean, the first social worker I met was a week after the fire. She was seconded over from Lambeth. She was so busy she had to go back to her job a few days later. And then we just received care from a kind of mixture of well-intentioned but unprofessional support workers. So we're just determined that in the future, if anyone else experiences the trauma and loss that we experience, that is at least met by trained social workers.
Thank you, Ed. Thank you. Was there anything else you wanted to add? I'm going to...
No, that's really what I had to say.
Absolutely. So from the bottom of our hearts, thank you very much. And just to kind of try and summarize, for me, kind of having worked with you for a while now, Ed, what stays with me is this tragedy in 3 acts, and this immense sense of loss and abandonment and chaos, but how well placed we are as social workers in terms of our skills, our knowledge, our theoretical backgrounds, our values, to be that service to respond in situations such as this. So thank you ever so much.
Thank you very much for having me. Thank you for having me.
Our pleasure. I'd now like to hand over to Mariam Raja, who is a lecturer at the University of Greenwich. You're just on mute, Mariam.
Oh, typical. Hi, everyone. So as Andy said, my name is Mariam Raja, and I am a lecturer at the University of Greenwich, which you can see behind me. So what I'm going to say actually echoes on really from what Ed said, but it's a bit like a jigsaw. So I was the social worker in the situation, and they were the people we were providing support for. But actually, it just really echoes on from what Ed was saying. So I am a university lecturer now at the University of Greenwich, and I am a qualified social worker. So I have practiced social work over various boroughs in London. And that also include being, as Ed said, I was seconded from my original post to support with the Grenfell Tower response as a social worker. So I'm going to reflect more on, let's talk about the experiences I learned from that. Like I said, echoing on from what Ed said about the need to be prepared and the need to recognize a specialized skill set that comes with disaster-based social work that may be here in the UK, and I'll speak in a UK context, we're not that prepared for. So in my role, I quickly learned that when certain situations or scenarios came about, that I did feel a lack of being prepared. And when you don't feel prepared, there's a lack of confidence in the work you do, and that will have an have an effect on the outcomes and the interventions you are doing. So, drawing it back to the CPD module that we're launching today, from my experience from doing disaster-based social work, I recognized a need for, this module and training to be given to social workers so that we're not in a situation that when we are dealing with the disaster, that we're not prepared for it. So we started working with the disaster-based steering group with BASW, and we created the CPD module. And I think it's important to note that although there is probably existing literature out there. When you're in that moment and you're doing that social work, you know, you don't have either the time or the thought process to go to the library to get a book or go search a journal, you know, on disaster-based social work. So I think there is something about saying, yes, there is existing literature around this subject, but there was a need for all of it to be put together in a way that is accessible, a way that can be reached for the social workers if they need it during that time, and that can be done in their own pace. So I think the module was a response to some of those things that us as the social workers, like I said, echoing on from what Ed said, felt a lack of preparation and felt like there needed to be resources we could attend to outside of the existing resources that exist. I think it's also important to note that although universities, and we do teach quite a bit around crisis-based social work, to recognize that there is a difference between crisis-based and disaster-based social work, and that we need to be looking at the particular skill sets, theories, narratives, really. I mean, more important than everything is, you know, hearing the narratives of people who have gone through it and learning from them. So I think that was really key. And that was what this CPD tried to put together, the narrative of people who have either been social workers like myself or have experienced disasters, and then also using people from a research background. I think it's key to note that a pilot, you know, was done around the CPD, because we didn't, you know, simply want it to be about just the narratives of experts. You know, it was about how do social workers respond to this, and we took the narratives of the social workers and edited that work. So I think that's also a key part, because sometimes when you engage in training, you know, it can sometimes just seem like a narrative of the expert, but this was including loads of narratives to try and get something that met everyone's need. And, you know, lastly, on the CPD, I think the most important part is the part around self-care, which is something we're talking more about in social work. But I think the key word there is the self. And I think to recognize that when you are doing this form of social work, as Ed said, you have the best intentions, and you do, as the professional, you have the best intention to do the best for the person you're supporting. But also to recognize that working within disasters and working with people who have gone through such intense trauma does have an impact on the self. Sometimes saying that during the disaster may feel, you know, may feel like it's being selfish, but we're trying to get that narrative out that we know that it will also, you know, that secondary trauma will have an impact on you, and it's not a selfish thing to say. So that part of the unit kind of covers that, to say we recognize this and here are strategies to support with it. Just moving on really quickly, having moved into higher education now as a lecturer, you know, I can see the gap in higher education where there isn't a discussion around disaster-based social work. And I think something like this can be very, you know, useful to introduce to students as a skills day, as an independent study, as an independent project, set reading, you know, anything like that. And for local authorities, I think discussions around this CPD can be had in, you know, supervisions, at appraisals, for people's self-development. So I think it's really key that these things are introduced as, you know, because I feel like students or social workers, whatever stage you are at, I think the key message I'm trying to say that it's actually very important to be prepared before these disasters occur, and to feel like you are confident in whatever way you can to give the best outcomes to the people we are supporting. And I believe that using resources like this CPD ensures that the response doesn't come from a place, again, from good intention, but panic and chaos, and that it is an organized response, and that organized response receives, you know, the best outcomes for the people we are trying to support. So thank you. That's what I had to say on the CPD module.
Thank you, Mariam, and really powerful messages, I think, to the sector in terms of the importance of different narratives, but also the focus of self-care, and clearly the responsibility both of organisations with self-care, but also how we can support practitioners, but particularly social workers, in their unique role in supporting people in the context of disasters. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'd now like to invite Lynn Romeo. I'm not sure if Isabel's joined us yet, but I'd like to invite Lynn, who's Chief Social Worker for Adults, and Isabel, who's Chief Social Worker for Children and Families, to just share their views and comments, both about the CPD resources that we'll be hearing more about, but clearly Lynn and Isabel are aware of them already, and about the context of organisational responsibility and the unique contribution that social workers bring to this work. Thank you.
Great, thanks. It's Lynn here. Just to say, unfortunately, Isabel's on leave today, so she won't be able to join us, but we've agreed a joint response and picking up on Maris's comments. We've both really valued the work that has been done on this agenda and led by BASW. And I think it indicates the breadth of social work and how much of a contribution good social work practice can make in responding to disaster work, and how it can influence so much of what goes on across the system, but most importantly in terms of people's experience and supporting them through that journey, both within England and the wider UK and internationally. There's so much to learn from the international work that goes on in this area. So both of us are really going to encourage people engaging with this fabulous learning opportunity. We know how important it is, particularly in local authorities, for us to really, and I was really pleased to hear Ed say what he's going to put before the inquiry, to really position social workers as trained key professionals to provide a really good support service in those awful situations that people face. So it's fantastic work to the British Association of Social Workers. Well done, you've done a fabulous job. And just speaking from my own experience, my first experience of having to deal with a disaster situation was when I was a young social worker working in Bradford, and we had the Bradford fire at the football stadium. And I have to say my experience and learning from that was really positive, because the Director of Social Services at that time really organised the social workers to be linked to every family affected to provide ongoing support, and it made such a difference. So it's key work, and as organisations working across health, social care, and community services, we have such a key, vital role to play. And I think this brilliant way of getting people supported and trained and confident in this area, and also being at the fourth emergency service, if you like, which is a really good description, is absolutely vital. And we all want to make a difference, a positive difference, don't we? So well done, BASW, and both Isabel and I, and through the Principal Social Workers Network, will really be promoting this fantastic opportunity for people. So thanks for inviting me, and really pleased to support it. Unfortunately, I'll have to drop off in about 15 minutes. I'm in the middle of a conference here, but thank you very much for inviting me, and thanks, Maris, for all the work you've done to coordinate it.
Thank you, Lynn, and especially for your commitment, both as Chief Social Worker for Adults and Isabel's commitment as well, because we really are collectively and collaboratively want to take this work forward. So thank you, that's absolutely brilliant. I'd now like to introduce Lena Dominelli, Professor of Stirling, Professor of Social Work, but I do feel at times you are the Professor of Stirling University, to present findings from a systematic literature review on social workers in disasters that was commissioned by BASW England, and it informed the training that we have launched today. And there's some brilliant work that also Lena's been involved in that she will talk about. So thank you very much, Lena. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Maris, for that warm introduction. As Maris said, I'm at Stirling University, although a lot of people think I'm still at Durham, which is a bit of an honor in some ways, but worrying in others. I'm going to talk about the Systematic Literature Review, or SLR, as it's called for short. And I'm going to begin by saying that I want to thank BASW for commissioning that and making sure that we have an invaluable resource which can be used in social work training in the future. But I also want to thank Ed for sharing his horrendous experiences with us, and also to thank Miriam for giving us a bit of insight on what it's like to be a practitioner in these chaotic, distressing, and awful situations. And I speak as a qualified social worker, as a practitioner who's worked in disasters since the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami, and in community development before that, which were different kinds of disasters. But I talk about disaster, and I think Miriam mentioned this, as something that exceeds the capacity of a community to normally deal with the distress and the extent of a disaster or event that stretches its resources. So that's how it differs from an emergency. And I'd also like to add that the Civil Contingencies Act 204 has said that social workers are first-tier responders under the local authority. But I hasten to add, the local authorities have been remiss in their duty to provide that strong, confident workforce, because they've asked social workers to volunteer rather than train them for the work that they need. And also the 204 Contingencies Act requires social workers to sit in the local resilience board. So there's a lot of opportunity if we put pressure on the local authority to actually fulfill its legal obligations. Now let me turn to the SLR. There are 3 takeaway messages I want you to take from this, because this amazing resource allows you to, 1, see disasters, including climate change, as a social work issue. There are resources in that from across the world that are very relevant to you. 2, there is a substantial literature that can help you understand what other practitioners, other academics, and researchers have done to create a body of knowledge that will help us do the job that we are supposed to do. And 3, there are also articles that show us the content of the training that we need to be able to do our job effectively, confidently, and well, because we are the only profession in the world that claims we want to enhance people's well-being. So with that start, the SLR is a huge resource. We went from over 8,000 articles to finally focusing on 187 critical ones. And there are 2 documents that you can look at. They're both on the BASW website, and they're written very simply and clearly to help you use the material that we thought, and we being myself as the lead on the research, but also one of my PhD students, Jess Cleary, who did a lot and most of the actual groundwork in finding all the articles based on what I could tell her from my many years of experience. What these SLR did was to look at 10 strings, which are what you use to find the articles and publications that you want. And these articles and publications included both refereed articles and what we call the grey literature. That includes UN publications, government publications in this country, and so on. And there were 3 questions around which these 10 strings were based. 1 was, what are the roles that social workers have in a disaster? And you won't be too surprised to find out there are many. I counted 18 of them, but all of them should be familiar to you. They run from coordination to kind of delivering services. Question number 2 was, how well did social workers perform their roles? And basically, most of the literature found that social workers did their job very effectively, but that may be because, of course, you're not going to write very much about experiences that have not worked very well for you. So there could be a bias in that. And thirdly, how do we improve the training? And there are loads of articles that show this, and they're really aimed at placements and also the content of academic work. And this whole experience started off with a woman called Armiti Desai from India. She was the head of social work at the Tata Institute of Social Sciences. And in 1947, there was the Gujarati earthquake, and it is the first recent modern recorded example of social workers going and doing work. And these social workers were students as well as some practitioners that Armiti Desai convinced to join them, and some academics. And they really focused after the event and helping people on debriefing themselves, because they found they became extremely distressed by what they saw and what they felt. And I think we had some indications of that earlier. And secondly, to really focus on the content that should go into courses. And I have to say that as far as I'm concerned, some of the best examples of content are still available through the Tata website. These were added to in 2004 by people working on Hurricane Katrina in the southern US, especially people at the University of Louisiana, and then also people who were responding to the Indian Ocean tsunami, which is where I came in, and I started an organization for the International Association of Schools of Social Work to start taking seriously the fact that there was nothing in policy or practice on disasters in the organization's networks and body of knowledge, and sadly, not even in the International Federation of Social Workers. So the 2009 Copenhagen meeting of the climate change Conference of the Parties, or COP, was where I organized the first social work in modern times global social work conference with IFSW, the International Conference of Social Welfare, and IASSW, to provide some information and to try and change what was going on, because social work wasn't even there in any way, shape, or form. And then I wrote a 100-page application to get social work involved in the 2010 and subsequent COP meetings, which it's been doing ever since, with a combination of speaking at these meetings, having exhibitions, and having side events, depending on the success or not of the applications that are made for side events and exhibitions, because there are now 9,000 NGOs involved in those meetings. But since that 2004, 2009 impact, we have had horrendous earthquakes, although the worst earthquake in the world was 1556 earthquake in Xi'an, China. But since then, we've had the 2008 Wenchuan earthquake in China, the 2010 Haiti and Christchurch earthquakes, and the 2015 Nepal earthquakes. But the best prepared countries, there are two of them. One is Japan, which is really superb in being prepared, although you wouldn't believe that after Fukushima, but being prepared to deal with disasters. Social workers are somewhat involved, but not very well trained for it. And Chile, where they are really well together and social workers are involved, but again, poorly trained. And those are the best examples that we have for social work engagement as a regular matter in disasters that strike those countries. And we do have a very good article that I think people could look at for how to involve students and social workers in disasters. And that's one by Finley, Potic, and Giordano in 2017. And these are all on the SLR, so you can look them up. But I would also like to add that since the disasters that I mentioned, there have been loads of others, but of course they're not natural disasters. A lot of them have been chemical and other kinds of disasters, fires like the one Ed talked about, but also one that's been going on for many years and still hasn't been resolved, which is the chemical disaster in Bhopal, India, where people are still struggling to get justice. So I hope this is not an indication of how long justice takes to be served. But the data that we found shows that social workers are very good at dealing with the traumatic experiences that people have, the mental health experiences they have, focusing on identity and belonging and making people feel that this is their space and they need to protect it, to help especially children fight the predators, and that's basically by getting them into schools and into their families as quickly as possible. And the development of green social work, which came about in 2012 as a result of all the different disasters and research that I'd been involved in. And what we found was that social justice, anti-oppressive practice, human rights, and community development and collective action were really crucial to successful disasters, and the literature bears this out. And so the main thing that was left out of the literature until you got green social work was the duty of us to care for the environment. And I picked that up from the fact that I come from a country where the Indigenous people of Canada, the First Nations, have been arguing that they're the custodians of the earth, and that's what we should all be. And other Indigenous people in other parts of the world have said the same thing. So we need to add to all of these training articles the additional ones that come through the green social work perspective, which aren't always seen as disaster interventions, but they are. And that is because we have a duty, and I argue for this, to care for Mother Earth and everything it contains. And some Indigenous people, like the Maori in New Zealand, have taken that to heart and sued a company that was destroying their sacred river, and won the legal suit that they brought against it, and they had to clean up the river, and now the Maoris are enjoying their sacred rights as they should have done all along. I'm just about finished.
Thank
so
you. It's wonderful, but we just need to move on. That's great. Thank you.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that for the UK, floods are our biggest disaster, and the worst that we've had were in 2007. And there are two books that have happened since the SLR that I would like to refer you to. One is by Lucy Easthope, who is our par excellence practitioner on disasters. She's not a social worker, but she does social work. And that is When the Dust Settles. And the second one is by Greta Thunberg, because we really need to honor young people and their commitment to doing something about climate change. And she calls it the Climate Book. And that's it. Thank you very much for listening to me. Bye.
Thank you, Lena. And again, really powerful messages, particularly in terms of our protection of Mother Earth and climate change and the impact of disasters within that context. Thank you. I'd like now to introduce Jo Hanley, who's a lecturer at the Open University and who's taken a lead in the development of the resources and the pilot that has taken place. So big thanks to Jo for all your hard work and contributions. and over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Maris, and thanks to Ed and Mariam and Lena for kind of setting that setting the table for the training and what I'm going to discuss now. You know, it really speaks to the three key things that informed this training, and that's the experiences of social workers who have responded to disasters, the experiences of those who they have responded to, and the existing research that was out there, which is substantial, but not necessarily always related to the UK or England context. So this is a kind of brief slide about messages from research. I do think that Lena's pretty much just covered this and talked about kind of the long history of social work in disasters. This is not some kind of new revelation in the last couple of years. And alongside that has been a long recognized, and not just in the UK, but externally as well, feature of social work responding to disasters, and that's that there's a lack of training. And the literature review that Lena did really emphasized that, as well as the Out of the Shadows book that's been discussed already, and the experiences. There we go. Yeah. So that's yeah. You can knock back to the other slide though, just for a second. Thank you. Yeah, and they're not exclusive to the UK context. So a lot of the research that went into that literature review did come from externally, and some of the most interesting and relevant stuff to the training here was examples of training that could be built on. So that was another area that we kind of used to inform this, which was the existing examples of training that were there. Okay, thanks, Beth. I think you're doing it. Next slide would be great. Yeah, brilliant. So it's been touched on. Lena mentioned about the fact that it's a legal imperative. So before I kind of introduce this training, which I know, you know, this is the launch event for that, it's to really stress this, that, you know, the Civil Contingencies Act does make local authorities Category 1 responders, and as such, they're required to provide training to staff in relation to emergency planning. Social workers respond to disasters frequently, and they complain about not being trained for that. So arguably, in particular for any local authority representatives here, it's a legal requirement to provide that training for social workers. So we do hope that this kind of short, online, easy to access training will be able to help you know, bridge that gap a little bit in a straightforward way that local authorities and other employers can engage with. And as Ed messaged earlier, it's important that this kind of message gets out there, that this is a legal imperative, that it's important. And if that could get in front of, you know, the Grenfell inquiry, that'd be absolutely amazing. And then obviously don't forget about the fact that social workers in England and elsewhere have a national requirement to engage with CPD. So this training course that I'm going to talk about now, that hopefully could help meet that for people as well. Next slide would be great. Thanks. So the CPD, the development of this training started a few years ago. The Social Work in Disasters Working Group, the BASW England one, that started a few years ago, and we had a lot of work going into the deciding where we take that. COVID-19 obviously shifted a lot of that work, and we ended up kind of helping to develop guidance and support for social workers. But the need for this sort of disaster training was only more emphasized because of the COVID-19 pandemic, which, you know, that is a disaster. And the point has been made before that since COVID, all social workers are disaster experienced social workers. So this guidance was developed back in 2019, and its specific focus was to inform any CPD for disaster social work. So it's, again, it does have a decidedly UK England focus, and you can see there that it's mapped to the PCFs and it's mapped to the PQS and the KSS for adult and children to help inform that. But the training, this guidance was there for anyone to pick up. So even if you don't want to utilize the online remote training that I'm going to talk about here, that guidance is there that could inform you to develop your own, maybe location or employer or team specific training as well. And it's got 12 learning outcomes to guide that kind of development. And they also help to guide that systematic literature review that Lena's talked about. So it all kind of works cohesively to inform the training that I will hopefully get onto now. If you could change the slide again, thanks. Yeah, so I don't need to say more about the systematic literature review that Lena's just talked about. It's huge. It brought so many resources in. It made the development of the training so much easier because we had that recent, clearly defined research base to develop the training from. The full literature review, I've got the link there. I'm not sure if it was put in the chat already, but it'll be shared with resources at the end. And then, yeah, building off that, it was about developing some sort of training for social workers, the kind of training that could impact quickly and be pragmatic for social workers to engage with, while also being realistic to develop. So a development and pilot were funded through the Open University, where I work as a lecturer in social work. And we are lucky at the Open University that we were also able to draw on the expertise of that kind of distance model. And in particular, the Institute for Educational Technology were really helpful in that as well, in designing the training. Next slide, please. So the training development, the training itself is based on 4 modules. So each module is 4 hours each. So that's estimated time, because the training is designed for you to work through it at your own pace. But the presumption is that it would take about 2 days, so 16 hours total to do. And the pilot study that I'm going to get on to talk about in a second confirmed that most participants did agree that that was about right. It can be engaged with individually, so anybody in this room right now after this session can click on the link and just start it at your whatever works for you. You can go into it, you can work through the activities. There's a workbook there to support you in doing that. So anybody can do that, but it could also be engaged with collaboratively. And we did have examples in the pilot study of social workers in the same team working together to while they did that training, and they talked about the value of kind of supporting each other, meeting to discuss the training. I did answer a question in the chat earlier. It's a English focused context of the training, and that's because we did want to be able to draw in legislation, policy, and things to make it that specific. But I would like to think that people outside of England would definitely get something out of it, and even people outside of the social work profession, because there's a lot there to inform just the broader context. It's hosted by BASW England, so it's on their website again, which is it's openly access. It's not just to BASW members; anybody can click on it and use it. And really importantly, it's free to access, so that should really help. It's the ability to use it flexibly, to be able to engage with it broadly. And yeah, I think I've repeated there about collaboratively and individual. So, and the pilot study as well talked about this wider team engagement. So it wasn't just individuals working on it themselves, but when people engaged with the materials, they shared it with their team, they discussed it at team meetings, they talked about it with colleagues. Some of the tasks that they're asked to do as part of the training specifically encourage that. So there's tasks around engaging with disaster response team, or whatever they might be called, within your workplace, and other kind of more collaborative aspects of that wider team engagement. So we tried to build that into it as well. So it does feel a little bit less like it's you on your own working through the materials yourself. Next, please. So the 4 modules there, we've got an introduction to social work and disasters, really important for obvious reasons. The next module, and each of these, like I said, takes about 4 hours alongside. That includes some preparation. Excuse me. Don't know why that rang. That includes some preparation reading before that, and some follow-up reading, as well as a follow-up task for each of these modules. So module 2 is about law, policy, and best practice. So we draw in a lot of the legal and policy elements there that I talked about, that, as I mentioned, are England specific, but they're not necessarily, that shouldn't restrict the engagement with this training. Module 3 is focused around quite a few important themes, as were raised in the systematic literature review, but also informed by that training guidance. And that's person-centered working, research-informed practice, and multi-agency working. And then module 4 is kind of bringing in that theory element of it, but also a really important section about self-care. And self-care is something that was consistently raised in our engagement with the BASW Disasters Working Group of Social Work Experiences, and just how challenging self-care is during disaster contexts and working in that. All of the modules include preparation reading. They've got text, video, and audio elements, individual tasks, like I said, to do in the workbook, and the suggestions of further reading and follow-up. So if anybody here is familiar kind of with OU materials and has worked through them before, they are kind of similar to that, with some slight changes in relation to the BASW hosting, but it was built upon that kind of model. Next slide, please. So here's just a taster of some of the content that's in the materials. So you can see just 4 screenshots of aspects of that just taken from across there. So you can see aspects in there about defining what is a disaster. That's obviously early on in the training. There's the legal side of things in the Civil Contingencies Act. There's some more kind of critical things around disaster capitalism, and you can see embedded in both of those are short tasks to complete in the workbook that's provided. And yeah, and then just another slide about multi-agency working, giving you some information about that. So this is just to kind of give you a bit of a taste of what the training looks like, because it's quite difficult to think about it in the abstract. The next one would be great, please. Yeah, so the pilot study that we ran for this, you can see the really great research team listed there. There's a link to the pilot study report there as well, so please go into that. We're also hoping to get this as an academic publication shortly, but all the key crucial elements of the pilot study and the findings are in that link as well. There were 6 social workers, were given 10 weeks to complete the training, and yeah, I think we're going to go on to some of the findings in the next slide. So the findings were overwhelmingly positive about the content, about the potential for this type of training to support the increased confidence, increased knowledge, increased engagement around disaster social work. And there's a lot of different elements that were brought into that. Some of them are highlighted here. Those are all quotes underneath them of things that the participants said. And you can see group learning is included in there, which was a really important aspect that we were really excited that came up in the pilot, because that was a question we had about how engaging and how collaborative these materials could be. And so it was really great to see that people were engaging with their teams, engaging with their workplaces. And this was not stuff that they were told to do. Part of the training wasn't, you know, go talk to your team about this training, but several of the participants did. Participants weren't, or the people who were undertaking the training, they weren't told to become disaster responders within their workplaces, but several of the participants did as a result of doing this training. So those were really great findings to see how that kind of impacted on the wider team. Yeah, and stuff about self-confidence, innovation, and new ideas. And I think that was another key finding. The idea that, you know, when the experiences of social workers that we talked to going into disaster settings, it was really tough at times to step outside of that strict, narrow statutory role that's increasingly dominant in social work in the UK, and think, you know, when you respond to a disaster context, you often have to be innovative. You have to come up with new ideas. There's no set playbook to what that response will require, which did make the development of training like this quite challenging, because you can't just tell people this is what you need to do, X, Y, and Z. It's more about kind of supporting social workers to understand that they have the knowledge and resources and skills to respond to disasters already, and identifying where they are, and then to give them the confidence when they do respond to go to a disaster setting and say, look, I'm here, I know what I need to do in this context. I'm going to have to use my own professional judgment in that context, but that professional judgment is so important in disaster response. And just understand that, just being able to assess a situation and try to come to an understanding of what's needed and what response is needed. So we really tried to drive home that in there. And you can see, yeah, for some people, it felt like a bit of a knowledge refresher, just of especially when it came to things like ethics and values, which really underpinned, you know, the research and the training materials as well. Next slide, please. So as well as all those super positive things about the potential for this training to have a positive impact, as I think probably any social workers in this room could expect, there were workplace challenges that participants experienced when trying to undertake the training. That was by far the most challenging aspect of the training that people brought up, was just carving out the time to do the training. And that's not unique to this training. You can see there's no lack of reports that show how much social workers struggle to engage with CPD in their workplaces because of a lack of time, too much workload, and all those things that most people in the room will be very aware of. So it became a challenge for us about, first of all, how to kind of mitigate that as an issue. You know, this is already flexible training that people can do, try to fit around their roles and their workplaces, but still there were challenges in this regard. This was not for lack of trying from the participants. Participants talked about trying to do this on their annual leave, at weekends and evenings, during their lunch breaks, in the middle of the night. Some of them talked about trying to do it. So it wasn't for lack of trying from their perspective. So we really tried to think about how we could convince employers of the importance of this training. So one of the things we came up with was an employer letter. So this is a letter that any social worker can take and give to their employer, sign their name to it, and say, you know, this is the training that I want to do. This is what it contains. This is why it's relevant to my workplace, and this is the support that I'll need from you as my employer. And that way everybody's transparent from the start. Obviously that doesn't, you know, solve every issue with workplace challenges. We hope that that can help social workers kind of make that argument for why this is needed and why they want to engage in this. We are running an employment engagement event. I'm going to talk about that in a second, so we might be able to get more involvement from employers through that. And yeah, the whole training is based around flexibility. So really, if social workers aren't able to kind of fit this training around their workplace demands, then I don't see how they'd be able to fit any training around their workplace demands, because they can take it on as they want. Next slide, please. Yeah, so next stages. This is an important and challenging and exciting aspect of all this. As I said, we've got employer manager engagement event coming up on the 3rd of October. The details of that will be shared after this event, I'm 90% sure. If not, then we'll find a way to do that. On the same day, there's a practitioner engagement event, so we want to make sure that any social workers or other practitioners that want to engage can come and ask questions. And those two events are more around, you know, this event is a lot about kind of telling you about the training, explaining the value, giving some background in it. Those events might be more, or will be more, focused on Q&A, an opportunity for you to kind of come ask the specific questions about how it works. Maybe you've already clicked in, done a little bit, and you have some ongoing questions about that. So that's what those events are for. So as many of you as can come, please come. Anybody that you know that couldn't attend today, suggest to them maybe coming to those events as well. There's a national conference, a national disaster conference. We've ran a few of these before, and there's another one coming up in November where this training will be talked about again, and maybe some updates of the training and how it's going. But also a lot of other really great stuff will be talked about at that conference. So keep an eye out for that. I think I saw a question pop up a second ago about a register of disaster-informed social workers. So that's one area that we definitely kind of think that this training could inform. If social workers undertake this training and then we know that they're disaster-informed social workers, then in the event of a disaster, they could be called on. That could be a local disaster, maybe in the local authority they work in, if they work in the local authority. That could be nationally, where if there's a disaster, social workers could be pulled across, you know, boundaries and respond to disasters. And it could also be internationally, as Lena's really pointed out, that their disasters almost always have an international element to them. We really try to drive that home in the training, but that could also be driven home in relation to how this training is used going forward. That obviously creates challenging questions about who maintains that pool of disasters and how social workers remain currency, how the training remains up to date. These are all issues that, you know, we're going to be toying with going forward. But, you know, we're in this room today. There's over 50 people here. We've had chief social workers endorsements, BASW here. I really think that, you know, if this kind of group of people and all the people involved can't make that disaster pool and that disaster register work, then it's not going to work at all. And that's really unfortunate, because that's been the experience up to this point. Research constantly talks about the need for, when a disaster happens, having that knowledge of where are disaster-informed social workers who can respond or coordinate a response if more people and more social workers are needed to be drawn in. So hopefully this is a step in the direction towards fixing that kind of gap. But how that's going to look, I have absolutely no idea at this time. Another hopeful use of this training, as well as kind of getting social workers ready for the, you know, hopefully not too frequent examples of disasters that they have to face, is also to rapidly upskill social workers responding to disasters. Now, Ed already talked about the fact, and I think Mariam did as well, about that social workers don't always respond immediately to disasters. Often it's days, weeks, months down the line, and that work is ongoing. It's not short term. So having this training, like I said, 2 days training that people can engage with quickly, you know, that in response to when they're called on to respond to a disaster, should hopefully be really valuable. And maybe some of those employer workplace demands might get pushed down because it would be more immediately needed to get social workers trained up. So if in future, if a social worker is told, like, you know, next week you're going to be joining something similar to what the Grenfell recovery team was, they could take 2 days, undertake this training, and then go with a little bit more knowledge, a little bit more confidence, a little bit more ability to support people effectively in those contexts, while also, you know, having the added bonus of safeguarding themselves, because they'll have a lot less uncertainty and they won't have the stress, as much stress related to what they're going to do when they get there. All of that, we got to think about climate change and increasing disasters. You know, I don't need to point out to examples or evidence of climate change and the fact that it's having increasing impact, and we're seeing more and more disasters occurring. So this is going to be more and more important going forward. We can't get away from that. There's also the potential for working in disasters to be embedded into social work education more. I know Lena's done some really good work on that too. And I think, you know, while this training is short term, I've heard this kind of training called, you know, quick and dirty training, that shouldn't remove the potential for more integrated engagement with working in disasters being embedded into the social work role and social work education and qualifying as well. Excitingly, we've already had charities, local authorities, NHS trusts, government departments, international partners who are rolling out this training and want to roll it out further. So I'm really hoping that, you know, some people coming to this session today will be doing the same, and others will. There is a feedback form that I'm hoping to, well, we're all hoping, because it's got information relevant to all of us, to gather some feedback about those who maybe have already started to do this training in their workplace or individually on their own, but also those who plan to do it going forward, and how that will look. So that's a short feedback form, shouldn't take you more than 5 minutes, well, unless you go into really, really long detail. And I think that will be shared in the chat or afterwards. I'm hoping I can share it in the chat in a second anyway, if not, but it'll be definitely shared with everybody who signed up to this following this. So it'd be really appreciated if you could fill out that feedback form as well following the session. And I think that's it. There's tons more that I could talk about this, but hopefully some questions will lead into that. And impressively, we're at time that we thought we would be. So that's great job, everybody.
Thank you, Joe. That was a brilliant overview in terms of the training and the pilot. And again, special thanks to previous speakers who will hopefully join our panel now. So thanks to Ed, and I'd just like to re-emphasize that really strong message of the sense at a community level and an individual level of feeling abandoned, and we've got to make a difference. That can't happen again, and it's how collectively and with the unique contribution of social workers as well, we can make a difference at a community level. Again, Mariam's point in terms of the importance of self-care was extremely powerful. And the commitment from chief social workers to actually saying this needs to be on the agenda. We need strategic partnership, and we need at an operational level to make sure that this actually happens, you know, training, CPD, and making sure that social workers are also core to that work and response and delivery. Lena's beautifully highlighted again the impact in terms of climate change and the importance of research and the use of literature reviews and also the international context. And I'd also like to say special thanks also to Angie in terms of her contribution of Out of the Shadows book and the role of social workers in disasters, and that may be something that will come up in discussions going forward. Now, this is an opportunity really for, so I'd like to invite all of the guest speakers and who've participated to come on camera. And this is an opportunity for attendees to ask any additional questions that haven't necessarily been covered in the chat. There's one question that I would like to start off with. Sorry, I'm also checking the questions that have been sent to me. So if I'm looking away from the screen, apologies for that. But it was also about the focus of community social work. And a really pertinent point. So the question, and I'd like any of our panel members to come in and respond to this. How do we ensure that community development training is included within core social work training? And there's a reference to this person actually saying it was integral to their training in the 1980s. And I think, again, listening to what Ed was saying and Mariam, how do we ensure that the community is respected and valued and that it's embedded again into terms of social work training? So any initial thoughts or comments that any panel member would like to come in on that? Come on, don't be shy. I can't see any hands up from this side.
Oh, okay, I'll go. So I'll break the
Go
silence.
for it,
I was
Mariam.
going to say, like, obviously from my experience now, like in higher education, it is something I try and focus on. So with my students in the first year, I do teach them about community profile and not looking at the people you work with as just individuals, that we are all part of a wider community. And I think from my perspective now, being in higher education, that's where we can start those discussions, start getting students to think about looking at individuals as a part of a community. What does community mean? What does community development mean? You know, in regards to the work I did, I think we tried as much as a community, you know, probably not maybe the best way, but we tried as much as we can to listen to the voice of the community. And I know sometimes being the middle person between the people who are making the rules and then the people you are supporting and being that sort of advocate. But I can just say, yeah, from a training perspective, I think it is something I'm personally trying to include in the work. And I think it's key to something to continue to teach to students.
Thanks. Angie, thank you, Mariam. Angie and Lena, any comments on this that you'd like to add?
Just following on from Mariam's point, really, I know that what we do at Nottingham-Trent University is we involve a lot of the community groups in terms of taking part in the development of modules, but also in the teaching. So students can hear from community groups and what it means and that sense of belonging, and that emphasis that it's individuals are part of a system, you know, and that system might be a local one that's connected globally.
Thank you. And Lena?
Thank you.
Yeah.
I would like to just extend the point that Angie made about how important co-production is, that the community should be seen as leading the discussion. And we've been doing a lot of that in the course that I'm doing at teaching at Stirling University, where we have short placements where students are actually going out to consult with the community and get involved in community engagement and co-production. And I think that has to be a really important part of the teaching. It wasn't emphasized in the SLR that I referred to earlier. I think it was happening, but amongst a small group of people, and it's becoming bigger now. So I think that's one thing. And the other thing I'd like to raise is that for a lot of people, I think it's great that BASW is providing access to 2 days of free CPDs, but it is a real challenge to get local authorities to fund training. So this is a plea to both Lynn Romeo and Liz Trowell to fund social work training, to get the government to go back to replenishing training programs for local authorities for social work, because without that, we're not going to get very far. So it's really a plea for funding for training to go ahead. Thank you.
Thanks, Lena. And we've had a number of comments also about an emergency response register, including social workers. And I know that Joe has come back and answered that, but I'd be really interested, Ed, from your experience as well, in terms of the learning, if that is something that you would be advocating for as well.
So, I mean, my direct experience was that you know, like the really important thing is to have like a set of social workers who are ready to respond when the disaster happens. And I heard about, you know, people accessing training afterwards, but actually it's those crucial days after the disaster where you really, and when I say like a blue light response, I'm really talking about a blue light response. And for me, having thought about how that could happen, it's like, it's that need to have a bank of well-trained, prepared, willing social workers, you know, maybe in an area, so like Pan London, that can be taken from different teams so that no individual team is going to be decimated by the loss of social workers, but that they're there and that they're ready to respond. And for that to happen, we need to have organisation. We need to have thought about that before the disaster, and not like Grenfell, try and scramble around in the days afterwards. I mean, to the best of my memory, and Marion might counteract this, but for me, it was like it took like at least a week for social workers to turn up to help us. I think before that, our needs were being met by housing officers from within the council. I think the disaster happened on a Wednesday, and to the best of my knowledge, it was like a following Wednesday, Thursday, that the first out of borough social workers came to help us. So for me, it's about having a bank of registered disaster responders, social workers that can be contacted and can be sent out literally in the days after the disaster. So yeah, so whatever needs to happen to make that happen, and Grenfell United are fighting very hard to get that recommendation in front of the public inquiry. But then obviously we need that to be responded to at a higher level within local authorities, within, you know, the hierarchy of social work as well, I imagine, to really get everyone to sit together. And look, what we don't want to be doing is having this discussion again in, you know, however many years' time when there's been another disaster and we haven't got that register in place. So those are my views on the question.
Thank you, Ed. And Lena, and then I've got a question for Joe. Go ahead, Lena.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to what was said. I think that it is crucial that we have such a register and a good body of well-trained social workers who can respond to any of the issues that come before them. But for me, the real question is, how are we going to get to that? And I think it is a professional-wide issue that needs a professional-wide collective response, but it also needs people with lived experience of disasters. And yes, I take we're all involved as lived experience of COVID, but that's not enough. We also need a whole range of other lived experiences, and we need resourcing. And this is where we need to get somehow or other. Social work has failed since the 60s, as far as I can make out in this country, to have the ear of politicians. And we need them on board because they're the ones that don't see us as relevant to this, that don't see us as relevant to anything, basically, but I'm being very cynical at the minute. But they really do not, like, unlike in the Nordic countries where social workers are seen as having answers to the crucial social problems of their day. There's no such equivalent here. So we really need to focus on them as well as the things that Ed said. Thank you.
Thank you. And Joe, there's some really positive commentary coming in also about the resources and the pilot as well. I mean, there's a couple of queries in terms of whether there's potential to update the resources on a regular basis, and I appreciate that's a kind of a collective approach to it, but certainly some commentary about that. And also the engagement of social workers who may not work in statutory services and how we kind of reach those people as well within that training. So any kind of comments or thoughts on that?
Yeah, 100%. The training was not designed with just a local authority focus. Sorry if I gave that impression during the presentation, but that was more about trying to reiterate the importance of it within local authorities as the employers of the majority of social workers in England. Yeah, the training is very much developed in a way that there's no aspects of it or no tasks involved in it, no follow-up tasks that wouldn't be relevant to any workplaces that social workers work in. So I do hope that that's clear, and yeah, 100%, please do it. We already have some charities who are engaging with the training, and it's been really positive. So yeah, please do.
Thank you. We've had a helpful comment as well from Reese online in terms of looking at potentially BASW accessing the joint organisational learning portal, and again how we could share these resources as well, and that's something that we can certainly take forward. There was also reference by an attendee about just raising some questions really about I know if I'm correct, an overseas attendee or somebody who's working here from overseas, who's saying that within the Philippines, you know, social workers are core to the kind of disaster response. And I just wanted to share with that person who'd raised a query that there is training that takes place at a local authority level across different organisations and stakeholder roles, but social workers do not necessarily participate in that training, and it's not mandatory in terms of social work education training. Lena, again, Joe and Angie, can I just ask how, you know, and Mariam, from a, you know, higher education perspective, how is social workers in disaster training covered, or CPD currently, being really honest and transparent about that on the courses that you're involved in? Mariam, thanks.
Yeah, so I was going to say that currently, obviously, there's not much on the curriculum around it. So obviously, my presence coming into the institution, it's something that I have been pushing, but it's, you know, I'm currently finding spaces in modulars where I can connect it in some way and then do a session on it. And I speak to every cohort I teach. I've spoken about my experience and what I can learn from it. But it's, from my perspective, I'm still trying to find spaces in my module where I can say, okay, if it's trauma informed, then I can go on and do an afternoon on disaster-based social work, as opposed to just being an integrated part of the curriculum. And I think that is something I have spoken to with my line manager, and something I want to bring to the spotlight. So I think it's still something that we as educators in higher education have to kind of find the space for, and have to continue advocating for. And I think, like, the more these events happen and the more we put focus on it, then, you know, maybe there will be a change nationwide. But from an honest perspective, it's still something I'm personally finding the space to put into the curriculum and teach around. But, you know, it's not set, you know, there's not a whole module, there's not a focus on it. So it's myself advocating for it from my perspective at the moment.
Thank you, Mariam. Angie, did you want to come in there?
Yeah, I'd kind of echo Mariam's. I try and thread it in where I can, but it's a really crowded space, the curriculum, you know, and it's So I think that's our challenge, really. It is how we squeeze it into already crowded space.
And I think it goes back to the comments that Ed made earlier in terms of the inquiry as well, the Grenfell inquiry. If collectively there can be statutory changes and recommendations, we're not sure whether that will happen, but the importance of this becoming mandatory training, both in terms of social work education, but also a plea to all of those online from an integrated perspective or a local authority or voluntary sector perspective, is that this is so important in terms of training and CPD. And we really want social workers to be at the heart of this work and to work with partners to support and make that happen. So any support that you can offer, and by joining our national group, that would be appreciated. Joe?
Yeah, I just wanted to mention as well about the crowded kind of education landscape and what's needed, and the fact that kind of disasters social work doesn't really get on the agenda, and that's led, you know, Social Work England's new training and education standard, the KSBs that they're introducing. You know, disaster social work isn't on there, and they're huge, so it's gonna take really almost activist academics to to kind of promote this within their universities, and that's not really a great foundation for developing a profession that's able to respond effectively to disasters. So I think there's definitely various organizations that need to be kind of targeted with trying to get this on the agenda, and I was very disappointed to see that Social Work England, their KSBs don't include it.
Okay. Well, maybe that's something as well, Joe, that we can take back to the National Steering Group in terms of taking forward after this meeting as well, with Social Work England. That's a really helpful comment. I'm very conscious of time, folks. So what I'd like to do is just to first of all, say a really, really big thank you to every single person that has contributed today and in terms of presentations. Particular thanks to Ed, everybody, but particular thanks to Ed. It takes courage and bravery every time you share your story. And I think it was also evident again, you know, just how raw that story is. And we must never, ever, ever forget what happened. And hopefully collectively we can influence change and make sure that people don't have to go through that sense of abandonment again. Really, really important message there, Ed. Before we finish, I'd just like to share some of the events that will be taking place. They will go up on the screen just as we come to an end of this event. So we've got an event for employers, and we really want employers across the sector to hopefully join us on the 3rd of October, and the details are there. We have a practitioner event again on the 3rd of October from 1 to 1:45, and this is again an opportunity for practitioners to learn about the resources, but also to drill down in terms of any more questions that you may have. We have a Social Workers in Disasters conference on the 16th of November. That will be looking in the context of England, but also from an international perspective with speakers focusing on climate change as well. And finally, in terms of the England Social Workers and Disaster Steering Group, if there is anyone who has expressed an interest today, please contact. If you're interested, you want to take this work forward with us, then that's the email is there, england@basw.co.uk. And also, if you can make sure that you tap into our England events as well to register for any of those. I'd like to thank all of the attendees who have asked the questions and taken the time out from busy schedules today to join us. And finally, there's also some information about the QR code to access the training as well. Just to finish off, we've got 5 minutes left, and I'd like to finally ask each of our participants, speakers and people who contributed to the event today to share one final key message for attendees to take away. So I'm going to start off with Joe, actually, if you can come off mute, Joe.
Yeah, sure. I think it would be just about kind of that momentum and not losing that, because this is something that's been developed over a few years and it's kind of coming to a culmination here. which is great. It's amazing that we're at a position where we can launch this training that, you know, so many of us have put so much time and effort into, and yeah, and hopefully get that out there. But then, you know, there's been some really great ideas here. There's that pool of social workers and how we kind of develop that. It's about engaging with politicians, regulators, all sorts of things. So I think it's about, yeah, trying not to lose that momentum, because this is so vital, as has been mentioned, and I don't need to reiterate. And, you know, disasters will come up again, and we social workers deserve to be better prepared, and those they support deserve to be better prepared.
Absolutely. Ed, could I invite you to share comment to participants to take away?
Sure. So I mean, just having been a social worker and being a victim of a disaster, it's just that understanding that, you know, social workers are, in my view, the best placed people to respond to a disaster, and we have to do whatever it is to make sure that our knowledge, our values and our expertise can be deployed when it is needed. And yeah, so whether it's working with, you know, government to ensure that that happens, whatever it is, we'll be doing what we can to ensure that we can get a recommendation from the public inquiry. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Mariam?
Yeah, so just yeah, I'll just echo what I was saying earlier. I think the takeaway from it is, from my experience being the social worker in a disaster, is I think the key word is preparation. Like, we need to be prepared. The more confident you are in something, the better outcomes you have. So I think this is a response to that need that we found, that we need to be better prepared. So I think whatever way this can be integrated, we talked about higher education, local authorities, outside of local authorities, or just doing it independently. But I think that's the key thing, that it's not something we see as an add-on to social work. And I think it is currently seen as an add-on. I think we need to start a narrative that this is social work. If we're being called into support in these situations, this is social work. It's not an add-on. And we need to start treating it as if it is social work, and we need to be prepared for it the same way we are prepared to do local authority assessments or mental capacity assessments or whatever. We need to view this form of work exactly the same as that form of social work. So that, I think that's my key takeaway.
Thank you, Mariam. Lena?
Thank you. Yes, I agree with what everyone has said so far. And I would add that this is a collective issue. We have to work together as a profession to get our voice heard and embed training for disasters and emergencies as well, in qualifying training, in specialist training, CPD training, and even doctoral training. We've got to get that seen as a role for social workers, not something I keep getting told, why should social workers be involved in that? Or in this UNFCCC COP meetings, what do social workers have to do with this? Even though I've been going there for a long time, saying this is what we've been doing, never mind what we could do or would do. So that to me is the most important issue. Get it embedded.
Thank you. And Angie?
I guess for me, since I've been involved in this work, and today was a reminder that social work in disasters is about people, and a reminder that it's about working with people on various levels in terms of practitioners, those individuals in the community. So whilst we might use that kind of catch-all phrase of working in disasters, it's not just numbers that we're talking about, it's actual individuals and real people.
Thank you, Angie. And I'd fully support all of those really powerful statements. And my final comment is that in addition to all of those pertinent points that have been raised, you know, this work and the role of social work is also about social justice. And please make sure that you hold on to that and you take that forward as well. You are advocates of change, and it's how we work with communities and people with lived experience. So thank you all so much for today. Please get involved in this work and promote the resources in your organisation. Many thanks for all of our hardworking and fabulous presentations by our participants and contributors. Take care and hopefully get to drink some more water after the session. Many thanks.